Hey hooligans! Welcome back for our very first official Wit and Wisdom lesson of the year. So, Wit and Wisdom, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a program that your teachers, aka me, or whoever else is watching this, we use to help teach you guys reading comprehension, and it also helps with your writing. So, we're going to be reading some amazing books this year. You guys are going to be following along via these videos, or if you're face to face, you're going to be following along that way as well. And we're going to be diving deep into these books so that we can better understand them and learn to love them even more than we already do. So, before we begin, I need you guys to go ahead and open the Google Doc that is attached to the assignment from today, or to the assignment for today, and answer questions 1 and 2. So you don't have to pause the video. You can just keep going from here, and I will pause it. So questions 1 and 2, and I will read you those questions. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to open it. You go to your Google Classroom. At least for my kids, you go to your Google Classroom. So you go to my room, Miss Shelton's room, and then you go under classwork and you find today's date, and then it should be that assignment. So click that, click the Google Doc, and that is where you'll be working, and that's how it's going to work each and every day. You're going to go to the day, you're going to go to the assignment, you're going to click it, and you're going to be typing your answers and working in that Google Doc as I'm going along in the videos. So, question number 1 says, how does reading a book make you feel? Explain why. So y'all be totally honest. If it makes you feel like boo-boo, then tell me it makes you feel like boo-boo. If you love to read, then tell me that. But explain why. And this should be 2 to 3 sentences. So find that question number 1 and answer it in 2 to 3 sentences. Complete sentences with capital letters and punctuation. Okay, now that we're done with question 1, we're going to go ahead and do question 2. Question 2 says, "Who is someone that you know that likes to read, and how do you know they like to read?" So I'm going to need you to answer that with 2 to 3 sentences. I'm going to give you another 5 minutes. So be sure that at the end of this 5 minutes you have answered question 1 and question 2 with 2 to 3 complete sentences each. Okay, now that we are done with the questions, we will use this book, Mr. Lincoln's Way, to learn about questions and routines for how we're going to dive into books through the rest of the year. So it'll kind of get you used to how things are going to go in terms of what the questioning is going to look like, what the note taking is going to look like, and just how deep we're going to dive into the little bitty details of each of the books that we're going to read throughout this year. So you may remember some of this from last year, but we're going to review over the 3 types of questions that we go over each day for Wit and Wisdom. So these are called essential questions, focusing questions, and content framing questions. So put your hands in the air and go. If you remember these, your teacher will see you, aka me, or whoever else is watching this. So if you remember essential questions, content framing questions, and focusing questions, you remember your teacher talking about that last year, then go like this. Okay, perfect. Great. If you don't, no worries. So I'm going to explain what each one of these is. So when you are thinking about questioning a book, I want you to think about a pizza. Stay with me. I want you to think about a pizza. Think about your favorite pizza. Maybe you like cheese. Maybe you like pepperoni. Maybe you're a veggie kind of person. Who knows? Either way, pineapple doesn't go on pizza. Period. Moving right along. So questioning is kind of like a pizza. So the essential question is a big question that we're going to be talking about for a long, long time. So that is like the whole pizza. The entire pizza is the essential question. So it's a question that we're going to be talking about a whole lot. It's a question that we're going to be talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks. So that's the essential question. So the focused question or the focusing question is kind of like a slice of pizza, one slice of pizza. So that might be a question that we are only going to be answering while we're reading this book. The essential question, we might use that essential question for reading this book. We might read another book, but it's still going to be the same essential question. You have that same essential question for the entire module. So for the focusing question, it's like a slice of pizza. So unlike the essential question, which you might have which you're going to have for the entire module. So the entire module 0, your essential question is going to be the same. For the entire module 1, your essential question is going to be the same. That is just a big question that we want to be sure that we're going to be able to answer by the end of the module. But the focusing question, like I said, is like a slice of pizza. So it's a question that we're just going to be focusing on while we're reading this book. So the focusing question changes each time we change books. So that's like a slice of pizza. Now the content framing question is like a bite of pizza because that question changes almost every day. So that is more frequent. That changes every day. And then the focusing question changes with each book. And then the essential question changes with each module. Facts. So moving right along. The essential question for this module is, how does reading help us build knowledge? So you will actually be able to find the essential question, the focusing question, and the content framing question for today on your assignment. Please don't delete those. Please don't type over it. You don't need to mess with that at all. So that is what all of those words are that are at the top of your Google Doc. So if you'd like to click in your Google Doc right now, you can read all of the essential question, focusing question, and content framing questions as I am reading them out loud. Go ahead and click over now. So the essential question for Module 0 is, how does reading help us build knowledge? So that is a question that we should be able to answer by the time that we finish Module 0. So our focusing question, which is a question that is just about this book in particular, Mr. Lincoln's Way by Patricia Polacco, is, why was Mr. Lincoln so important to Eugene in Mr. Lincoln's Way? So I know you don't know who any of those people are, but don't worry, we will soon learn who they are and what the answer to that question is. But that is a question that we are going to have to answer by the time we get done with reading this book. Remember, the essential question we should be able to answer by the time we're done with the module. The focusing question we should be able to answer by the time we're done with this book. So that's the focusing question. So the content framing question, which is the question that we should be able to answer by the end of this lesson today, is, what do you notice and wonder about the book? So we're going to start with the cover of the book. So for those of you that remember noticing and wondering from last year, you're all set, but go ahead and keep listening because you may have different expectations for this teacher than your teacher had for you last year. So the first thing we're going to do is notice things and wonder things about the cover of this book. So I will go ahead and hold the cover of this book up. So on your Google Doc, you're going to notice that the third thing, it says number 3 by it, says book cover. And underneath that, it says notice with a 1 and a 2. So you need to tell me 2 things that you notice about the book. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to tell me 2 things that you notice in complete sentences. So I'm going to hold this up, and you're going to tell me 2 things that you notice about this book cover. Okay, now that we're done with that, we're going to wonder some things. So if you're wondering something, that means that you're asking questions. So what are 2 questions that you have about this book cover? So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to type 2 things in complete sentences, 2 things that you wonder about the front cover. Okay. So, now that we have finished noticing things and wondering things about the front cover, I'm really excited to see what you guys noticed and wondered, to see if it is anything that I noticed and wonder. So, we're going to go ahead and read the book, and then as I am reading the book, I need you to be thinking, because if you notice number 4, see what I did there? Number 4 says read a book, and then it says read aloud. So, as I'm reading, you need to come up with 3 things that you notice about the book. So by the time I get done reading, you should just about be done telling me the 3 things you notice and the 3 things you wonder. So we are going to go ahead and start reading the book. What I recommend doing is listening and watching me read the book, because that way you'll be able to see all of the pictures and you'll be able to put faces with the characters' names, and then maybe quickly clicking back into the document, the Google Doc, and typing one thing you notice every once in a while. Or you could just wait and do all of your notice and wonders at the end after I get done reading the book. Mr. Lincoln's Way by Patricia Polacco. So this is the inside cover of the book. Let me scoot over so we can see it better. This is the inside cover of the book. A little picture. I already have some things that I'm wondering. This is the next page. Mr. Lincoln was the coolest principal in the whole world, or so his students thought. He had the coolest clothes, had the coolest smile, and did the coolest things. He had tea parties with Mrs. West's kindergarten every spring. He took Mr. Bliss's 6th graders on nature walks in the fall. He set up his telescope next to the pond in the back of the school on special nights and invited kids and their families to come look at the stars. And in the winter, he was Santa for the Christmas play, lit the menorah for Hanukkah, wore a dashiki for Kwanzaa, and a burnous for Ramadan. Mr. Lincoln was just plain cool. Absolutely everybody thought so, except Eugene Esterhaus. Mean Gene is what everybody called him. Mean Gene sassed the teachers and beat up on most of the other kids on the playground. He was no student at all. He drove Mrs. Dunkel crazy in English. Miss Chu wanted to drop him from art class altogether. He was a bully. He always seemed angry, picking on kids and calling them names. He's not a bad boy, really, Mr. Lincoln would say, only troubled. To just about everybody in school, though, Eugene was trouble, spelled with a capital T. Then one day he leered at a 1st grader. "What are you looking at, scumball?" he said, and he pushed her down and wrenched her backpack away. "I'm going to tell Mr. Lincoln," she announced. "Go ahead, you little brat. I ain't afraid of that." And that's when he stopped, because he saw Mr. Lincoln standing right there. The bell rang, and Eugene scurried away. Now Eugene was in Mr. Lincoln's thoughts more than ever. He knew he had to find a way to reach him. You see Eugene up here, scurrying away, and you see the little girl right there, and that's Mr. Lincoln. Then one day, as Mr. Lincoln was helping the 5th grade plant a tree in the beautiful atrium, he noticed that Eugene was looking up into the branches of one of the other trees. There sat a bright red cardinal. 2 other days, Mr. Lincoln had seen Eugene standing at the same atrium window, watching birds on trees. Mr. Lincoln wondered, was it possible that... See, even Mr. Lincoln was wondering. It wasn't a day later when Mr. Lincoln called Eugene into his office. Eugene slumped into a chair. Mr. Lincoln took a beautiful book out of his desk drawer, a book in blazing color and all about birds. He turned to one page and studied the illustration. "I've got these little birds all over my tree, and I don't know what they are." Eugene got out of his chair and walked a little closer. "Oh, those are red-capped nuthatches. Weird to see them this time of year." You seem to know about your birds," Mr. Lincoln said with a warm smile. "I do. I lived on my grandpa's farm. He had tons of birds around. Chickens, trashers, meadowlarks. We raised carrier pigeons together, too." "You've got quite a grandpa," Mr. Lincoln said. But Eugene just turned his back to Mr. Lincoln and left the room. A week had gone by when Eugene ran into Mr. Lincoln by the atrium, looking glum. "I have a problem," Mr. Lincoln said. "So?" said Eugene. "That atrium was supposed to be full of birds, but they're just not coming." The principal looked into the empty atrium. "Wrong plants in there to make them want to stay. Not the right food, either." Eugene started to walk away. "Your grandpa teach you that?" Mr. Lincoln said. Eugene turned and looked at Mr. Lincoln for the first time. "Maybe." "Do you suppose you could help us attract birds here to our atrium, Eugene?" Mr. Lincoln handed him a book. "And perhaps this would help." Eugene seemed stunned at first, and then he took this beautiful book on birds in his hands, wrapped it in his arms, and bolted down the hallway. Definitely wondering things and definitely noticing things at this point, so I hope you are too. As the days passed, Eugene never seemed to be without that book. His English teacher let Eugene read passages from the book in class. "I'm so pleased to see him reading," Mrs. Dunkel exclaimed. And when he didn't have his nose in that book, he was constantly out in the atrium. He and Mr. Lincoln made a list of plants and shrubs to buy and types of grain and seeds to feed the birds. They even built 3 feeders together. That's when it started to happen. The birds began to come. Nuthatches, bluebirds, a tanager, and many colored finches. So many different kinds that the whole school stood from time to time just to watch the wonder in the atrium. Eugene seemed genuinely happy, and he didn't even tease the other kids anymore. You see all the kids just looking in the atrium? Then one day, Miss Chew burst into Mr. Lincoln's office. "There are 2 mallards nesting in the atrium." Those are ducks. Mr. Lincoln rushed to the hall, and sure enough, there in the atrium were a male and female mallard. and there was their nest near the southeastern corner of the atrium. Mr. Lincoln saw Eugene on the other side of the atrium, giving him a thumbs up. "I was hoping that they might be a mating pair," Eugene said one day as he and Mr. Lincoln looked at the 5 perfect eggs in the nest. "Just one problem. The ducklings will need to be near water. They'll need to get to the pond outside, and they can't fly out the top like their parents." "You'll think of something, Eugene. I know you will," Mr. Lincoln said, and he put his hand on Eugene's shoulder. It was nice that Mean Gene wasn't mean anymore. You see the mallards and their eggs? It was only 3 days later that there was a commotion in the hallway. Mrs. Belding rushed into Mr. Lincoln's office with Eugene in tow. Mr. Lincoln looked at Eugene in disbelief. "What happened?" "I'll let Eugene tell you," Mrs. Belding trumpeted. But Eugene said nothing, just sat looking hateful and defiant. "Trouble in the lunch line," she went on. "He singled out 2 of our students from Mexico. He called them brown-skinned toads and other very unacceptable names." "I'll take care of this," Mr. Lincoln said quietly. Mr. Lincoln sat down in front of the boy. "Eugene, my skin is brown too." Eugene just glared at Mr. Lincoln. "This I know. Eugene, someone who loves birds the way you do couldn't possibly have that kind of hate in his heart for people with different colored skin than yours." Then Eugene began to cry. "My old man got real mad when I got home late from helping you," he sobbed. "He said you're not our kind." "Our kind," Mr. Lincoln murmured. He led Eugene to the window of the atrium. It was alive with the songs of birds. "I see sparrows and jays and cardinals and the mallards. Don't all of those beautiful types and colors make this a beautiful place to be? For all of the birds?" Eugene nodded yes. "Well, God made all of them, all kinds, just like He made us, Eugene. Fact is, all of you children here with all of your cool differences are like my little birds. Yes, my little birds. And that should be your answer to what is right and right or wrong in what your father said," Mr. Lincoln said quietly. "My old man calls you real bad names, Mr. Lincoln. He's got an ugly name for just about everybody that's different from us." Mr. Lincoln didn't talk for the longest time. "Eugene, sometimes people get trapped in their thinking almost as surely as those ducklings will be trapped in that atrium," Mr. Lincoln said thoughtfully. "My grandpa just wasn't like that." Mr. Lincoln put his arms around the boy's shoulders. "I'd like to meet that grandpa, but Eugene, you have to promise me, even when bad things happen at home. Here at school, you need to treat all my little birds with kindness and respect. No more teasing and name-calling. Please promise me." And Eugene promised. Eugene was good to his word. He became a model citizen. He tried with all of his heart to keep his promise to Mr. Lincoln. Then one bright morning, Eugene stopped at the atrium window. The eggs were starting to hatch. He ran from room to room and brought the whole school to watch. The ducklings were hatching one by one. At first they were wet and unsteady, but in a short time they were fuzzy and racing about. So you see that one? It's a brand new one. It's all wet and unsteady, and then these are the fuzzy ones. As the days passed, the mallard parents flew out of the atrium, landing on the pond just behind the school. They were leaving their babies for longer and longer periods of time. Eugene and Mr. Lincoln knew that the time was approaching when they would need to get the ducklings out of the atrium and into the pond. They had a plan. So do you see Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Eugene back here? And look, this is a good picture of the atrium. You see how it's in the middle of the school? When the big day arrived, classes were asked to stay in their rooms. Then Eugene and Mr. Lincoln opened the door to the atrium and stepped in. They had both practiced saying, "Ging, ging," like the Mallard parents, and now they talked to the ducklings, coaxing them to follow. The Mallard father waddled up to the doorway of the atrium and peered down the hall. At the end of the hall, the father Mallard could see the lawn and the pond. "Eek, eek," Eugene called the ducklings. The mother Mallard came out first, then one by one her babies followed. Eugene walked down the hall, calling them over and over as the family waddled behind him. Then, all at once, the mother and father took the lead, and the ducklings scurried after them. At the outside doorway, they stopped for a moment. Then the mother and father Mallard jumped out of the doorway and coaxed each of the ducklings to follow. So they led the ducks from the atrium down the hallways of the school all the way out the back. Can y'all imagine leading some ducks through Meadow Park? Whew. Mr. Lincoln and Eugene both stood and watched as the ducklings raced down the hillside and plopped into the pond with their parents. "Now I know where the expression 'like a duck takes to water' comes from," Mr. Lincoln laughed. He couldn't believe how well the babies were able to swim. Parents had gathered at the top of the hill. They had been invited to watch from afar. Then Eugene heard a voice from behind them call out his name. "Eugene, boy, over here!" It was his grandfather. The boy raced up the hill. Mr. Lincoln joined them both. "This is my grandpa," Eugene sang out. "I know," Mr. Lincoln said. Eugene turned toward him. Had Mr. Lincoln something to do with this miracle, with his grandpa being here? Now the old man shook Mr. Lincoln's hand heartily. "I would sure like to say thank you again." "I would sure like to stay with you again, Grandpa," Eugene said as he and his grandfather walked up the hill together. The old man put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "We'll see, son. We'll sure see," he said. Later, Eugene and Mr. Lincoln walked down by the pond together. Eugene needed to say something to Mr. Lincoln. "You showed those ducklings the way out, Eugene," Mr. Lincoln said. "Hey, you showed me the way out, Mr. Lincoln," Eugene smiled. Then he stopped and looked into the principal's eyes. "I'll make you proud of me, Mr. Lincoln. I promise." So, real quick, I realized as I was reading the book that I told you the wrong focusing question. So, it wasn't why was Mr. Lincoln so important to Eugene? It was why were the ducks so important to Eugene in Mr. Lincoln's way? Whoopsies, you probably were reading that on the document like, that doesn't say that. So the focusing question is actually why were the ducks so important to Eugene in Mr. Lincoln's way? So I don't know if you caught that. But go ahead and now, if you haven't already, go ahead and fill out the notice and wonder chart. So you need to tell me 3 things that you noticed and 3 things that you wondered. So that is the last thing we're going to be doing for today. So after you get done with that, go back through and check your answers. If you need to rewind the video to make sure that you've gotten all of the answers that you need, you may do so. And I will see you here in a little bit so that we can go over all the things that we noticed and wondered. Okay, bye.